A woman lost in silence, a wounded dog with one eye, and a garden that forgot how to bloom. But what if healing could begin with a paw print, with a child's drawing, or an unopened letter? If you believe that love finds its way back in the softest places, then stay with us. This story is for you. And if it touches your heart, please gently tap, like, subscribe, and walk with us through the Garden of Quiet Souls. Ash Hollow, a quiet little town nestled in the foothills of Oregon's Cascade Mountains, wore a shawl of mist that clung gently to its rooftops and tree lines. The air that late October afternoon was cool and perfumed with the faint scent of drying pine needles and lingering wood smoke. Autumn had stripped most trees bare, and the sun's rays, softened by a gauzy veil of cloud, fell gently on the unkempt lawn of a cottage at the edge of town. The house was a pale shade of blue, now faded and chipped with time. Its white shutters hung crooked like eyes too tired to open fully. Surrounding the house was a garden that once bloomed with sunflowers and daisies, but had long since been surrendered to weeds and thistle. Time had slowed here, paused perhaps ever since Alice Morgan's heart had broken. Alice, 67, was a tall, willowy woman with silver-streaked hair tied in a loose braid that fell over her shoulder. Her movements were deliberate, and her pale blue eyes, once bright with laughter, now often wandered into the past. A former art teacher, Alice had once filled the town's community center with color and joy. But 2 winters ago, her husband Leonard, her best friend, and the one who always smelled faintly of coffee and cedar, had died of heart failure. Since then, her world had turned into something quiet, gray, and safe. She stopped painting, she stopped pruning the garden, she stopped inviting anyone in. Now she spent most of her days in solitude, her hands occasionally brushing the petals of dusty silk flowers inside the house, or flipping through old sketchbooks filled with drawings Leonard once posed for. She was kind to those she met in the grocery store, but rarely lingered. Ash Hollow was a small town where people noticed everything, and Alice had become a figure of soft sadness, an echo that passed through once cheerful sidewalks. On that particular evening, as rain pattered gently on her roof and the wind teased the chimes on her porch, Alice stood by the kitchen window, clutching a chipped mug of chamomile tea. She noticed something unusual near the edge of the garden movement. At first she thought it was a raccoon, or maybe a fox, but as her eyes adjusted to the dusk, she realized it was a dog. It lay curled near the overgrown rosemary bush, half hidden in shadow and soaked from the drizzle. Its fur was a matted shade of gold streaked with mud and leaves. Alice squinted. Something was odd about its face. It had only one eye. The other socket was closed, puckered with an old scar, a pale pink line running down its snout. The dog didn't look up. It just lay there, breathing heavily, as though every breath had to be bargained for. Alice felt her pulse rise. She wasn't used to sudden visitors, least of all ones that came from the woods. Her first instinct was to lock the door, but something about the creature, its stillness, the way it refused to look scared or aggressive, gave her pause. She stepped back, opened the cabinet, and pulled out an old ceramic bowl with faded sunflowers on the rim. She filled it with water from the tap, and after a moment's hesitation, opened the back door. The rain had tapered to a mist, and the scent of lavender from the dying bushes drifted faintly through the garden, mingling with the smell of wet earth. Alice walked cautiously to the porch and placed the bowl near the steps. The dog didn't move, but its ear twitched as if acknowledging her presence. She didn't speak. Instead, she stood in silence for a moment, then went back inside, locking the door behind her. She watched from the kitchen as the dog slowly dragged itself forward, limping, favoring its back right leg. It lowered its head and drank deeply. Then it settled again, this time, closer to the porch, curling itself into a tighter ball. Alice didn't sleep well that night. The sound of the wind pressing against the old windows was joined by the rustle of memories and the steady ache of something she couldn't quite name. She dreamed of Leonard in the garden, pruning roses and laughing, then calling out to her, his voice echoing and fading. By morning, the sky had cleared into a pale blue. The cold was sharper, signaling winter's slow approach. Alice rose early, wrapped herself in a long wool cardigan, and stepped onto the porch. The bowl was empty. She glanced toward the rosemary bush and froze. The dog was still there. It hadn't left. But now it looked up. Its one good eye was amber sharp and intelligent, though dulled by exhaustion. Alice felt herself caught in its gaze, and to her own surprise, she whispered softly, "You're still here." The dog thumped its tail once on the wet wooden floor. She wasn't sure what to do next. She hadn't taken care of anyone in a long time. She didn't even own dog food anymore. But something inside her, the same part that used to teach children how to shade light into form or coax laughter from a stubborn canvas, stirred. She filled the bowl again. She brought out a slice of leftover roast chicken, and she sat on the top porch step, watching as the dog limped toward her, without fear, took the food gently from her hand, and then settled again nearby, closer this time. They didn't speak because neither of them needed to. The garden remained overgrown, the porch still creaked, and yet something had shifted. A presence had entered the quiet, and in the scent of lavender and rain, something long dormant in Alice Morgan's heart gave a tentative flutter like a seed in thawing soil, unsure but willing. The days that followed were dipped in golden stillness. Morning mists rose from the earth like breath, and the scent of damp earth mingled with the fading traces of lavender. Ash Hollow drifted through late autumn with slow patience. Its maple trees shivered with each breeze, dropping their last leaves like little notes of goodbye. And in the small house on the edge of town, something old and tired was beginning to stir awake. Alice Morgan, wrapped in her faded cardigan and soft flannel scarf, found herself drawn outside more often. The dog, though, still unnamed, had claimed a patch of sun near the stone path that once led to Leonard's vegetable beds. It no longer flinched when she approached. Its coat, though, still rough, glowed warmer in the sun. Its wounded leg dragged slightly as it walked, and it still bore the quiet weight of its missing eye, but it no longer seemed like a creature at war with the world. It was present. Alice had begun to talk to him, not with expectations, not with commands, just musings. She'd comment on the weather, or the way the crows had grown bolder. She even began reading aloud from her old journals, seated in the creaky garden chair, while the dog, who now wagged his tail every time she brought out a slice of bread or leftover chicken, lay beside her like a silent guardian. It reminded her of the way Leonard used to sit with her when she painted, saying little but always listening. It was on the 5th morning since the dog had appeared that a new voice rang out over the fence. "You have a dog, Mrs. Morgan." The voice was young and curious. Alice looked up to see a girl of about 7 peering through the slats in the backyard fence. She had curly red hair tied in 2 bouncing pigtails and wore a purple hoodie, 2 sizes too big, its sleeves smudged with paint. Her eyes, a bright, stormy gray, were wide with interest. "Not exactly," Alice replied gently. "He's more of a guest." The girl opened the gate without hesitation and stepped into the yard. She was small and quick, the kind of child who left footprints everywhere she went, not always physical ones, but always felt. Her name was Lily Thompson. She lived 2 houses down with her single mother, Sarah, who worked double shifts at the town diner and barely made it home before Lily's bedtime. Lily crouched near the dog, extending a careful hand. "What happened to his eye?" she asked. "I don't know," Alice said, watching the way the dog raised his head, alert but calm. "He hasn't said," Lily giggled. "Dogs don't talk, don't they? He says plenty to me." The dog sniffed Lily's hand and after a pause nudged it gently. Her smile widened. "He likes me?" Alice was surprised at the flutter of joy she felt. She hadn't heard laughter in the yard in so long. She hadn't seen anyone cross that garden path since Leonard's funeral. And yet here was this tiny paint-stained whirlwind of a child, making herself at home in her world as if invited. Over the next few days, Lily returned again and again, usually after school. She brought scraps of sandwich crust and stories about her classmates. She was an only child used to making conversation with shadows bugs and her stuffed animals. The dog became her newest confidant. Alice learned more about Sarah through the girl's offhand comments. Sarah Thompson was in her early 30s, tall and broad-shouldered, with deep-set brown eyes that rarely smiled. She had once dreamed of opening her own art studio, but gave it up when Lily's father left before she was born. Life had turned her practical, distant. She loved her daughter, but her affection was buried beneath exhaustion. Sarah often let Lily wander the neighborhood on her own, something frowned upon in town, but mostly forgiven because Lily seemed sharp and self-sufficient. One evening, as Alice poured hot water into a teapot, Lily burst through the back door uninvited. "Can I draw him?" she asked breathlessly. "For art class, we have to bring something that makes us feel safe." Alice hesitated, then nodded. "Of course. You can use my sketching pads." They sat together on the porch steps. Lily's hands were surprisingly steady for her age. Her sketch of the dog was simple but heartfelt: 1 good eye, soft ears, a slouched pose and a heart-shaped scar over the chest that she invented. "Because he's brave," she explained. "What would you name him?" Alice asked, watching the girls focus. Lily tilted her head. "Maybe Samson." "Like the strong man in the Bible," Samson, Alice repeated. "But he lost his strength in the end." "Yeah," Lily said matter-of-factly. "But only after he helped everyone." That night, Alice stood by the garden gate long after Lily had gone home. The dog Samson now, at least unofficially, was curled up beside her feet. She reached down and gently brushed a leaf from his back. "You're a strange visitor," she murmured, "but maybe not the wrong one." Just as she turned to go inside, she noticed a figure standing outside the fence. A tall woman in a faded waitress uniform, her hair tied back in a messy bun, arms crossed tightly across her chest. Sarah. "I hope Lily's not bothering you," she said, voice low and uncertain. "She's not," Alice replied, stepping closer. "She's a bright light." Sarah softened just a little. Up close, Alice could see the lines of fatigue etched into the younger woman's face, the way her shoulders carried something heavy. "She doesn't really have anyone to talk to besides me. And I'm barely around. She's welcome here," Alice said. "Anytime." Sarah nodded, hesitated, then added, "That dog, he seems to like her. He seems to like being seen." They didn't say goodbye, just shared a moment's understanding between women, shaped by loss and silence. As the night fell and the wind rustled through the dry lavender stalks, Alice sat beside the dog and watched the stars emerge. For the first time in a long while, her heart didn't ache, it simply beat. By the time November arrived in Ash Hollow, the mornings had become crisp enough to leave a silver sheen on the grass. The low hum of wind in the pines sounded like a whispering song, and every breath came out in tiny clouds. The garden behind Alice Morgan's house was still wild, but not quite forsaken anymore. Something had begun to shift, not loudly, but like a soft hand brushing away dust. Samson, the golden dog with the missing eye, had made the porch his resting place. His gait was still uneven, and his fur, while no longer tangled with bramble, retained a certain unpolished wildness. He had become a fixture of the yard, calm and gentle, a silent sentinel, who now seemed to understand that this patch of earth was his second chance. Alice found herself doing things she hadn't done in years. She swept the porch. She refilled the bird bath. She bought fresh sketching pencils, not for herself, but for the child who now arrived almost daily, bringing color with her wherever she went. Lily was never alone anymore. One gray Tuesday afternoon, Alice was in the kitchen slicing apples when the doorbell rang, an uncommon sound in her home. She opened it to find Lily standing there, bundled in her purple hoodie, and grinning like she'd just won a prize. Behind her were two more children, a boy with curly black hair and thick-rimmed glasses, and a smaller girl with long, straight brown hair, tied neatly with a green ribbon. "This is my friend Jacob, and that's Maya," Lily said, her breath visible in the air. "I told them about you, and about Samson. They want to come draw too." Alice blinked, her hand still resting on the doorframe. Jacob, around 8, looked thoughtful and a little shy. He clutched a sketch pad to his chest like it was armor. Maya, younger, perhaps. 6 had wide eyes and a mouth she kept pressed in a serious line, the kind that often hid deep wells of emotion. Alice hesitated. Then she saw Samson already wagging his tail behind the children, as if welcoming a tribe he had long been waiting for. "Well," Alice said, stepping aside, "I suppose there's room under the trees." They came the next afternoon, and the next. Word traveled fast through Ash Hollow's small streets, and soon a handful of other children began appearing after school. Henry, a soft-spoken redhead who loved to draw insects. Ava, who rarely spoke but sketched detailed flowers with startling grace. And Milo, a chubby-cheeked kindergartner who only came to sit beside Samson and listen to the wind. Alice hadn't meant to start anything. She certainly hadn't intended to become a teacher again. But somehow, under the old maple tree near the broken bird bath, a circle of sketch pads and giggles formed. The children didn't just draw the garden, they drew themselves into it. They painted wild roses blooming through fences, birds flying from cages, and golden dogs with shining eyes guarding their dreams. Jacob once quietly confessed that his dad had left last spring. His mother cried when he asked about him, so he stopped asking. Maya shared that her big sister had gone to live somewhere far after getting sick, and no one talked about her anymore. Ava didn't speak at all, but drew the same blue house with yellow curtains in every picture, though no one had seen a house like that in town. Samson sat in the middle of them, all soaking in sunshine and crumbs. He never barked, rarely moved, but the children found comfort in his stillness. He let them lean on him, drape scarves over his back, whisper secrets into his floppy ears. His presence stitched something together, unspoken, sacred. Alice watched from the kitchen window, with her heart slowly, painfully blooming. On the fourth afternoon, she walked outside with a basket of fresh-baked muffins. The children cheered. Jacob hugged her leg. Maya handed her a drawing. It was a picture of Alice standing in the garden, surrounded by children, with Samson lying at her feet. Her eyes in the picture were smiling. The garden itself began to change. Lily suggested planting tulips near the porch. Henry brought seed packets from home. Ava, though silent, helped dig holes with a little plastic spade. Alice began trimming dead branches, uncovering the stones Leonard had once placed in a spiraling path. The air filled with the scent of damp earth and future blossoms. One afternoon, as Alice raked away a cluster of dead leaves near the back fence, she uncovered a rusted tin box buried in the dirt. Inside were a few faded photographs and a handful of pressed flowers long since browned. They were, from years ago, pictures of Leonard holding a young Alice smiling beside the blooming lavender beds. Her throat tightened. She hadn't known they were buried there. She sat back on her heels, cradling the tin in her lap. Samson came and rested his head against her side. She didn't cry, not exactly, but the tears that welled in her eyes were soft and grateful. The days shortened. The sun dipped quicker behind the trees, and the garden often glowed with gold as the children packed up their drawings. Sarah, Lily's mother, began stopping by briefly. Always after work, hair slightly damp from the kitchen. Steam hands tired. She never stayed long, but one evening she brought a pie store, bought but still warm. "I never expected Lily to find this place," she said to Alice, standing in the glow of the porch light. "She found more than a place," Alice answered. "She helped me find something too." They stood for a moment, watching as Lily and Jacob spun in circles beneath the maple, laughing so hard they fell into the grass. "Maybe I could help sometime," Sarah said, glancing away. "I used to paint, you know. Not well, but it was a dream." "You're welcome here," Alice said, and meant it. As the week ended, a sign appeared at the edge of the yard, hand-painted on an old plank, "The Garden Classroom. Come draw with us." Lily had made it with Jacob helping spell the tricky words. Alice let them hang it proudly, even though it made her porch look like a lemonade stand. Still, something about it made her smile every time she looked at it. Winter crept gently into Ash Hollow, brushing rooftops with frost and drawing white outlines around every fallen leaf. The maple tree in Alice Morgan's garden, once the center of noisy laughter and sketchbooks, now stood bare, its skeleton stretching across a pale sky. The air was colder now, but the warmth between the children, the dog and the woman who once hid from the world, had only deepened. Alice had taken to leaving a kettle of cocoa on the porch and thick cushions on the benches beneath the tree. Sarah came by more often too, sometimes just to sit for a moment and exhale. The children no longer knocked, they simply arrived. Their presence was like sunlight through fog, uninvited but welcome. On a Thursday morning, dusted with snowflakes too shy to stick a new presence arrived. Alice noticed him standing at the gate just past 3 in the afternoon. He didn't open it, he didn't call out, he simply waited. He was around 9 or 10, with tousled brown hair that fell across his brow and oversized jeans cinched with a faded red shoelace. His hands were tucked deep into the pockets of his navy windbreaker. There was something deliberate in his stillness, as though the world had once been too loud and he had learned how to move within it quietly. Alice stepped out, brushing crumbs from her apron. "Hello," she said gently. The boy looked at her, nodded once, and lowered his gaze. He didn't speak. Before Alice could say more, Samson patted down the steps, tail wagging softly, and approached the boy. The dog stopped just short of him, tilting his head. The boy crouched, slowly reached out, and laid a hand on Samson's back, not hesitantly, not with fear, but like one would place a palm against a tree or a stone that had endured the same storm. They stayed like that for minutes, no words, no movement. Lily appeared from behind the garden shed, carrying a handful of pine cones for a craft project. She paused when she saw them. "That's Samuel," she whispered to Alice. "He's in my class. He doesn't talk." Alice glanced at her. "Not ever," Lily shook her head. "Not since last year. His dad, he was a fireman. There was a house fire. Samuel made it out. His dad didn't. The air turned even colder then, though the wind hadn't shifted." Alice's heart sank at the weight behind those few simple words. Samuel began to come every afternoon. He never knocked, never said a word. He'd arrive just after the others and leave quietly before dusk. At first, he only sat beside Samson, one hand resting on the dog's golden fur. But within days he began to draw. Alice gave him a sketch pad with thick ivory pages. His drawings were soft in tone, but rich in detail. A small cabin with smoke curling from its chimney. A winding path through a forest. A dog that looked exactly like Samson standing on a hill, its one eye watching a sky full of stars. He never drew people, not at first. Just places that felt safe, warm, distant. The other children seemed to understand. They didn't ask him questions. Lily sometimes scooted closer to show him her drawings, or Jacob would offer a crayon he liked. Maya, who rarely smiled once, slid him a muffin without a word. Samuel nodded in gratitude but never spoke. Yet his silence didn't feel like emptiness. It felt sacred. One afternoon, Alice sat beside him beneath the tree. "Do you want to help me repaint the birdhouse?" she asked softly, holding up a small wooden house with peeling blue paint. Samuel looked at it, then at her, and nodded. They worked together in the fading light, his strokes steady and deliberate. He chose a soft green and added a red heart on the roof. When it was done, he looked up at Alice with the faintest smile. It was the first time she'd seen his lips move into anything other than a line. Later, as the other children left in pairs or with parents waiting in cars, Samuel lingered. The sky had turned a burnt orange and shadows stretched long across the lawn. Alice offered him a mug of warm cider. He took it and sat beside Samson, the dog's tail thumping quietly. "Would you like to plant something?" Alice asked. "The tulip bulbs are ready for winter." He nodded, and together they knelt by the edge of the garden. As Samuel pressed a bulb into the soil, he glanced at Alice and whispered so quietly it almost vanished in the wind. He was brave. Alice's breath caught. She didn't speak. She simply nodded and gently pressed the earth over the bulb he had planted. The next day he came back with a small bundle wrapped in a scarf. It was a worn-out toy, a firefighter plush with faded buttons. He placed it near the base of the maple tree under a small rock like an offering. No one touched it. Later, Lily found a new drawing tucked beneath her backpack flap. It was of the whole garden, the kids, the tree. Samson curled beside Alice, and in the background, a man in a fireman's coat waving from the porch. She showed it to Alice, and they both said nothing, but their eyes were wet. That week, Alice bought a new sign for the gate. It read, "The Garden of Quiet Souls." Beneath it, Lily had painted a dog, a tree, and 5 small figures holding hands. By the time February faded into March, Ash Hollow had begun its slow thaw. The snowbanks receded like shy visitors, and rivulets of meltwater traced lazy paths down the garden steps. Earthworms resurfaced in the softening soil, and robins returned to perch on bare branches singing songs that trembled with promise. It was still cold, but the cold no longer bit, it hinted. In Alice Morgan's garden, something beautiful had taken root, beyond tulips and crocuses. Children's laughter blended with birdsong, footprints crisscrossed the once-forgotten yard, and every afternoon, the one-eyed golden retriever, now officially known as Chance, lay at the center of it all, his ears flicking with contentment. The naming had come about in a quiet moment. Samuel had been sketching beneath the maple tree, his legs tucked under him, when Lily had asked, "What do you think his name should be referring to?" The dog who had for months now become everyone's quiet companion. Samuel had paused, then written a single word in the corner of his drawing, Chance. When Alice saw it later, her heart skipped. It wasn't just a name, it was an offering. And from that day forward, Chance became more than a stray. He was the garden symbol of what could still be reclaimed. Alice, transformed more than she admitted, had begun organizing lessons under the tree. Nothing formal, but little rituals of care. She taught the children to plant seeds, sunflower, sweet pea, snapdragon. She explained how each needed light differently, how the soil had to be turned with kindness. The children pressed seeds into earth with small fingers, their faces serious, as though laying down pieces of hope. They painted the old picket fence in soft, mismatched pastels. Maya chose a pale mint green. Jacob preferred sky blue. Henry insisted on adding bees and butterflies. Milo smeared yellow across his section with joyful abandon, and when he was done, hugged the fence like it might hug him back. One afternoon, Alice introduced them to a curious tradition from her own childhood, painting bird traps, with watercolor and placing breadcrumbs beneath them, not to trap the birds, but to coax them close enough to be drawn. It's a game of patience, she told them, handing out tiny brushes and scraps of wood. The point isn't to catch anything, it's to wait and watch. They laughed when a cardinal landed just inches from Ava's trap, and then flew off again, its red wings like a flash of magic. Ava didn't smile, but she painted the bird that night and showed it to Alice with a proud nod. Samuel, once silent and curled inward, now smiled more often, those small, quiet smiles that bloomed slowly and stayed with you. His laughter, when it came, was soundless but unmistakable. His shoulders, once hunched with the weight of absence, now moved freely. He drew more than ever. One picture he gave Alice showed the garden as a map tree porch fence, each child marked with initials, and at the center, a golden dog crowned with flowers. News of the garden had begun to spread beyond the picket fence. Mrs. Delaney, a widow who lived 3 houses down and rarely spoke to anyone since her husband's passing, stopped by with a tray of lemon cookies. She sat on the porch for nearly an hour, watching the children, her eyes glistening, as she whispered, "This place makes me feel like I can breathe again." Mr. Whitaker, the retired mechanic who once barked at anyone who let a dog near his rose bushes, dropped off a box of old gardening tools, muttering, "Better they get used than rust." Even Sheriff Grant, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a permanent scowl and a voice that usually carried down the street like thunder, knelt in the dirt one Sunday to help Lily dig a compost trench. "Don't tell anyone," he said, glancing around, "but I used to help my grandma with her dahlias." Sarah, too, had begun to change. No longer just the tired woman in a waitress uniform. She now came in jeans and a loose cardigan on her days off. She brought paintbrushes, jars of button string, and scraps of colored fabric. With Alice's encouragement, she set up a small craft table for the kids, and though she still spoke softly and guardedly, her hands worked with a forgotten rhythm. "I used to do this," she confessed one afternoon, threading a needle through a swatch of cloth, "before everything got complicated. Maybe now it's time to make it simple again." Alice replied, her hands deep in a pot of soil. That night, after the last child had been picked up, and Chance had curled into his bed beside the porch, Alice walked through the garden with a lantern in hand. The breeze carried the scent of damp earth and chalk dust. She paused at the bird bath, where someone, probably Jacob, had placed a drawing beneath a rock. It was of the garden again, but this time the fence stretched into the sky, and each child had wings. Alice smiled. When she returned inside, she pulled open a drawer she hadn't touched in months. From it, she removed a set of oil pastels wrapped in linen. Leonard had given them to her on their final anniversary, whispering, "For when you feel like seeing in color again." That night, she opened her old sketchbook and drew for the first time in 2 years. By late April, Ash Hollow's sleepy streets awakened with color. Dogwood trees burst into bloom, and daffodils leaned lazily toward the sun, nodding to passers-by as if sharing a secret. Spring had wrapped the town in a soft floral shawl, and with it came the buzz of the annual Spring Renewal Fair, an event usually modest, featuring homemade pies, quilts, and a few booths selling lavender soap or wooden toys. But this year, there was something new stirring among the usual rhythms. The children from Alice Morgan's garden classroom had been invited to showcase their art. The idea had first come from Lily, of course impulsive, cheerful, Lily now missing her 2 front teeth and more confident than ever. "We should share our pictures," she declared, holding up a painting of Chance, his single eye glowing like a sunburst. Sarah, who had quietly taken on more of a co-teacher role with Alice, supported the idea. "Maybe it's time," she told Alice one afternoon, while stringing colorful yarn into a mobile of pressed flowers. "The world outside this fence should see what's blooming in here." So, preparations began. The children matted their favorite drawings on cardboard frames. Samuel, now more expressive in gesture, if not in speech, created a large piece with pastels, a field of tall, swaying grass, with a single golden dog sitting among them, looking skyward. He titled it simply, "Still Here." Alice had her own painting to contribute. It was the first full canvas she had completed since Leonard's passing. In it, she painted herself standing among an explosion of wildflowers, a gentle smile on her face, with Chance sitting by her side. The one-eyed dog was noble and still almost mythic in form. The brushwork was delicate yet bold, the sky behind them swirling with the hues of memory and rebirth. The day of the fair arrived clear and bright. The town square, usually quiet, save for the occasional dog walker or couple from the bakery, transformed into a flurry of booths, tents, and music. Children darted between stalls, holding cotton candy and pinwheels. There was laughter, and above it all fluttered streamers in pastel pinks, yellows, and blues. Alice's booth sat near the center, framed by a makeshift arbor covered in fresh vines. A banner painted by the children read, "The Garden of Quiet Souls," in swirling letters with small flowers drawn around each word. Their artwork lined the walls, clipped gently to twine with clothespins. Each piece carried a story, some sad, some whimsical, all real. Chance lay contentedly beneath the table, his head resting on his paws, basking in the shade, and occasional attention from curious fairgoers. Many paused to ask about him. Few left without kneeling down to offer him a gentle pat. Among the crowd was a man who stood out not for his stature, which was modest, nor for his voice, which was quiet, but for his stillness. He was tall and slightly hunched in his 70s perhaps, with silver-white hair combed neatly back and a cane resting in his right hand. He wore a brown wool jacket and had the kind of eyes that had seen long winters and deeper losses. He stood before Alice's painting motionless for a long time. Alice approached him gently. "Is there something you see in it?" The man didn't answer right away. His gaze flicked from the woman in the painting to the dog beside her. Finally, he asked in a voice like old gravel, "That dog, the one in the painting, is he yours?" Alice looked to where Chance lay his tail now, softly thudding as if recognizing something unsaid. "He's been with us for a few months. A stray, I thought." The children named him Chance. The man crouched slowly beside the dog and stared into his one remaining eye. His hand trembled slightly as he reached out. Chance didn't move away. Instead, he lifted his head and gently pressed it into the man's palm. For a moment, no one spoke. I think the man said quietly, "This was my son's dog." Alice felt the breath catch in her chest. He explained his son Daniel had served in the military. He was stationed in a base upstate and had adopted a golden retriever he named Scout. Scout had been trained to follow hand signals and keep calm during storms. Daniel would write home about the dog how he slept curled at his feet and barked only when someone lied. He used to say the dog had a sixth sense for pain, the man whispered. When Daniel died in an overseas conflict 2 years prior, the dog went missing. The army couldn't find him. He was presumed dead or stolen. No trace ever turned up. And now, here he is, the man said, with one eye, older, but still him. I know it. Alice knelt beside the man. "Would you like to take him home?" The man didn't answer right away. He looked at the garden booth, at the paintings, at the children, especially Samuel, who stood nearby, clutching a drawing of a field and a star. Then he looked at Chance again. "No," he said softly. "No, he's not mine anymore." His voice cracked. Looks like he found where he was needed. They sat together a moment longer, the man's hand resting on Chance's fur, his eyes filling but not spilling. "Thank you," he said, "for giving him a family." That evening, after the fair had ended and the town square had returned to quiet, Alice and Sarah packed the last of the drawings. The children helped fold the banner, giggling over who had spilled paint where. Alice stood before her painting one last time. It had received more comments than she expected. Some people cried, some simply smiled. All of them understood something without needing words. "Do you think Leonard would have liked it?" Sarah asked gently, rolling up a canvas. "I think," Alice replied, "he would have stood quietly in front of it for a long time, just like that man today." And with that, they walked home, tired, full, and gently changed. The first truly warm days of May brought a stillness to Ash Hollow that felt like the world holding its breath between seasons. The garden behind Alice Morgan's house, once choked with bramble and forgotten dreams, was now bursting with new life. Lavender buds peeked out from green stems, and the tulips, like proud children, swayed in colorful rows. Chance, the one-eyed golden retriever, had taken to napping beneath the lilac bush where the scent was strongest, and the bees were too lazy to bother him. Alice sat on the porch swing most afternoons now, a worn leather notebook in her lap, and a steaming cup of chamomile nearby. It was an old habit revived like so many others since the garden had begun to breathe again. Only this time, she wasn't sketching. She was writing. The letters had begun a week after the spring fair. She had found Leonard's old satchel tucked behind a row of dusty books in her closet. Inside were half-finished crossword puzzles, pressed ferns from a hiking trip in 1983, and 2 folded pages of a love letter she had once written but never delivered. She had been angry when she wrote it, frustrated over his forgetfulness. But reading it now, the words felt small, almost sweet in their pettiness. That evening, she sat down and wrote a new one. Dear Leonard, she began. I found myself laughing again today, the kind that sneaks up on you, the kind you once said sounded like wind chimes. Each day a new letter. She read them aloud to Chance, who never interrupted, who blinked his one eye slowly and seemed to understand everything. She wrote about the children, how Ava had started painting sunsets, how Jacob had learned to whistle, how Lily had declared she would be mayor one day, so she could make sure everyone got more recess and no one ever had to say goodbye. She wrote about Sarah, who now smiled more easily, her laugh a little raspier but more frequent. Sarah had cut her hair short, a choppy bob that framed her square jaw, and had started helping at the library on weekends. She's finding her corners again, Alice wrote. She told Leonard about the man at the fair who had once known Chance as Scout. She wrote about how he hadn't reclaimed the dog, how he'd simply placed his hand on the golden head and thanked her. That kind of goodbye, she had written, is the rarest kind when love lets go and still holds on. Sometimes she cried while writing, sometimes she didn't. One afternoon, while Alice read aloud, Samuel came to sit beside her. He didn't say anything he rarely did when the sun was this warm, but he listened. His hand gently rested on Chance's back. When Alice finished the letter that day, she looked down and saw that Samuel had written something on a spare piece of paper. A small sketch of a woman sitting on a porch swing, a dog beside her, and little floating envelopes drifting into the sky like balloons. Alice framed it and hung it on the inside of her front door. The garden continued to evolve. With the help of Mr. Whitaker, they repaired the old greenhouse glass panes. Mrs. Delaney planted herbs in mismatched teacups, lining them along the windowsill like a parade of ceramic soldiers. The children built a wind chime from bottle caps, keys, and driftwood, which they proudly hung from the maple tree. One day, a new child appeared. Her name was Clara. She was small and slender, with pale skin, long, dark braids, and eyes too big for her face. Her mother, Maria, was a nurse recently transferred to Ash Hollow's clinic. Maria was sturdy and warm-eyed, with calloused hands and a tired gait, the kind of woman who remembered birthdays but forgot her own needs. Clara was shy, barely speaking at first, but she had an unusual fascination with Chance. She would sit beside him for hours, whispering stories to his fur. Alice learned from Maria that Clara had been through several hospital stays the year before, and that the dog reminded her of one she'd had to leave behind when they moved. She doesn't trust easily, Maria explained, but she's sleeping better since coming here. Alice nodded. The garden has that effect. Clara eventually joined the others. She didn't draw as much, but she began leaving tiny folded origami cranes around the garden, perched on flower pots tucked in shoelaces, even balanced on Chance's tail. No one said anything. They just smiled when they found one. One late afternoon, as golden light poured over the fence and fireflies began blinking like sleepy stars, Alice stood in front of the children with a stack of her letters. "I want to share something with you," she said. They sat cross-legged on quilts laid out in the grass. Sarah stood at the edge, arms folded, but smiling softly. Clara clung to Maria's hand. Samuel nodded once, encouraging. Alice read 3 letters. One about the first time Leonard saw her painting and called her a storm disguised as a Sunday. Another about how scared she'd been the day she brought Chance inside the house for the first time. And a third, her most recent, about how she no longer waited to feel whole before she started living again. When she finished, no one clapped, no one spoke, but Lily crawled forward and hugged her tightly. "You should make a book," the girl whispered, "so more people can hear him in your words." Alice didn't reply. She just held Lily close. That night she wrote another letter. "Dear Leonard," it began. "I think the garden is not just growing roots, it's growing wings." The garden was no longer a place of mourning. By June it had transformed into something that seemed to exist outside of time, a gentle sanctuary where joy whispered through wind chimes, and grief softened in the rustle of leaves. The fence was no longer just a boundary. It was a frame holding together a living painting of color, laughter, and quiet healing. The once wild beds now bloomed with 1,000 voices. Tulips, foxgloves, marigolds, and lavender danced together in the breeze, humming stories of second chances. It had taken months of hands and hearts to bring it back to life. What was once Alice Morgan's private sorrow had become the neighborhood's shared solace. A new wooden sign stood proudly near the entrance, hand-painted in hues of soft cream and mossy green. It read, "The Garden of Quiet Souls," in English, and beneath it in smaller script, "Vuon Hung Lin, Hondu Dang. The children had helped decorate it with painted vines and pressed flowers sealed in resin. It was Jacob's idea to include the Vietnamese words. "It sounds like a lullaby," he said. Alice stood in front of the sign that morning, her hands wrapped around a cup of chamomile as Chance sat faithfully beside her. The sun glowed low and gold through the trees, casting their shadows in long, reaching strokes across the lawn. It was the morning of the garden's dedication, an event Sarah had planned quietly with help from Maria and Mr. Whitaker, who now seemed to have appointed himself unofficial fixer of all things wooden. A small stage had been set up with benches made from reclaimed doors and painted crates. Mrs. Delaney arranged tea in floral china cups on a side table, her arthritic hands moving with care. Ava stood proudly beside her newest canvas, a watercolor of the garden in full bloom, with the sky opening above like a silent song. Milo brought his recorder, promising not to squeak this time. And Clara Sweet Reserved Clara had written a tiny poem about hope and folded it into a crane, which she placed on every seat. Samuel arrived last. He was taller now, the soft angles of his face beginning to sharpen. His brown hair fell gently into his eyes, and his shoes were still untied, as always. But there was something steadier about the way he walked now. He didn't look for places to hide. He came directly to Alice and Chance and knelt beside the dog, wrapping both arms around the golden neck. Chance, older now, but no less gentle, responded with a slow tail wag and a small, contented sigh. The crowd of neighbors and families gathered slowly. The event wasn't grand. There were no banners or microphones, but it was honest. Alice stood before them all, not with speeches, but with a single story. Of the day she saw a dog lying half dead in her yard, and how he didn't just need saving, he came to save her. "I thought I had nothing left to give," she said, her voice firm but warm. "But I was wrong. I had space. I had silence. And into that silence, life walked back in. Sarah stepped forward next. No longer just the weary mother in a grease-stained apron, she now carried herself with ease. Her cropped hair fluttered in the breeze, and her eyes, once shadowed with fatigue, shone clear. She spoke of beginnings, the ones you don't expect. Sometimes healing doesn't look like hospitals or medicine. Sometimes it looks like a garden, a group of children, a dog who stays, and a woman who opens her door again. Samuel tugged gently at Alice's sleeve. He stood beside her, facing the crowd. His hands were trembling slightly, but his shoulders were square. "I want to say something," he said. Gasps were small but audible. Even Chance lifted his head. Samuel looked down at the dog, who had become his silent companion, his bridge back to feeling. Then he looked at Alice. His voice was soft, but clear. "Thank you, Chance." The moment settled over them like a benediction. Alice's eyes welled, but she didn't cry. Instead, she knelt down and hugged both Chance and Samuel at once. And in that embrace, the final thread of sorrow that had once woven around her chest loosened. Later, as the gathering drifted into gentle conversation and the scent of lemon cake filled the air, Alice wandered to the far end of the garden. She found herself standing beneath the wind chime tree, where one of Clara's newest cranes dangled from a string, catching sunlight in its delicate folds. Lily joined her there. She was sunburned and slightly out of breath, having raced with Jacob around the flower beds. "Do you think it'll always be like this?" Lily asked, her voice quiet. Alice looked around the painted fence, the worn swing, the chairs dotted with children and parents, and at the center of it all, Chance sprawled in the shade like a lion who'd made peace with the world. "I think," Alice said, "it'll always be enough." That night, after everyone had gone home and the garden was once again quiet, Alice sat on the porch swing with her final letter in hand. She read aloud as always with Chance curled at her feet. "Dear Leonard, today. The garden grew something I thought I'd lost, a voice I didn't know, was waiting a child's gratitude, a moment where everything paused in perfect grace. I don't think healing comes with time. I think it comes with love, gently sown and patiently tended. Thank you for the quiet, for the silence that let this grow." She folded the letter, tucked it beneath her sketchbook, and smiled. The stars blinked overhead, and the garden in all its gentle splendor simply listened. Sometimes the miracles we pray for don't arrive with thunder or lightning. They bloom quietly like flowers in a forgotten garden. Through the love of a child, the loyalty of a wounded dog, and the kindness of strangers, healing found its way back to a heart that had once given up. And maybe that's how God works, through simple moments, quiet places, and unexpected companions. If this story touched you, please share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment below to tell us what part stayed with you, and don't forget to subscribe to follow more stories that warm the soul. May God bless everyone who watches this. May your hearts be full and your gardens bloom again. If you believe in quiet miracles too, type Amen in the comments.